Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first Beyond the Data. And you're here with myself, Kathryn Huwig from, well, now I am from the Science History Book Club because they shut down, Facebook shut down my Understanding Ohio COVID-19 data, and they then subsequently shut down my attempt to make a 2.0 by telling me that I was violating community standards before inviting a single person or making a single post. So please find me at, Science History Book Club for lots of book recommendations. I'm also joined by Carrie Benton, who I don't even know what you are now. Are you still working for the CDC? You are not, I believe.
I'm just from the farm. No.
Just from
we have some short-term contracts that each of us are completing. So, but we're slowly migrating back into the clinical laboratory world on site. So.
And always filled with an incredible amount of knowledge. And that's also one of the reasons why we started a little late today, because Carrie and I started talking and Carrie started sending me stuff and showing me stuff. And we've got a lot to talk about. We are definitely not talking about it all today, but just lots of mind being blown for sure. But for today, what we're going to talk about a little bit is about just a small little snippet of some of the information that was put out by the CDC on June 23rd at their monthly meeting about the COVID-19 vaccines, and specifically relating to children and young adults and what kind of reactions they have been having to these vaccines, and in particular, myocarditis. So before we get into all that, since this very first episode, I just want to take the time to am I still here?
Yep, you're freezing a little bit, but you're still there.
Okay.
Oh, can you hear me? I hear you. You're just frozen.
Okay, you can still hear me. So long as you can still hear me, then I'm good.
We can see you now too.
All right, so you can hear me the entire time.
Yeah, I'm assuming that there's a storm. Is there a storm coming through your area?
It hasn't started yet, but it will probably be coming. Yes, but and I always have these problems. Somebody got a voodoo doll on me and all that. So I'll start again. We'll assume at least my voice will be carrying through. My image does not, and we'll hope that works. What has been my purpose from the very beginning when I started my group page, and also when doing all these videos with the post-depressor and things like that, I had one main purpose, and that is that there is no individual, there is no group, there is no organization, there is no institutions that are going to be able to stop that we are all living through. The only thing that could ever stop what we're suffering through is people, day lives, whatever possible way that they can, or small, whether it's talking to their neighbor, friend, or going out and talking to legislators or protesting, or whatever it is. It doesn't need to be big, but it needs to be. And that's what my purpose has been, is to try and educate people, and so that they can make those actions for themselves, take what I can put out, make it simple enough that it can be understood. And so am I still here? Am I here?
Yeah, you are. You're just okay. Cutting out.
Okay. Voodoo dolls. But that's the purpose of all of this, to make it as clean as possible. Unfortunately, the internet is not cooperating with me, but we will do what we'll do, try to get this working. And also I will try to put these slides up on the Beyond the Data page so that other people can access them and understand them. So without further ado, and hopefully Carrie will be able to jump in when I do cut out, to explain some of what is going on. So what I wanted to start with, because this particular slide combined with this particular tweet from Rochelle Walensky, who is the current head of the CDC, these two things together just blew my mind, because it shows just how screwed up the math is. You really need to do the math and actually think through what is being said and what it actually means. And so we can read this tweet, and it goes, to put this in perspective, if we vaccinate 1 million 12 to 17-year-olds, we could see 30 to 40 mild cases of myocarditis. And in this same million, through vaccination, we avoid 8,000 cases of COVID-19, 200 hospitalizations, 50 ICU stays, and 1 death. Okay, well, yeah, that sounds like it's all on the up and up, right? This sounds like it's pretty good. Yeah, that's all. Those are big numbers. Now, of course, we all know that what's a case. Does it mean that anybody's actually ill? Is it okay? What is going on? I mean, we know that most of those cases are going to be people who are not sick. They do not have symptoms. They're fine. They just tested positive. You guys, Carrie, you got to jump in for me, because I can't read the comments at the same time as I'm talking. I'm not good at multitasking. Okay, so all right, so we look at those numbers with the number of cases and hospitalizations and things, but then we look into what was put out there by the CDC. And we see those boxes down below, and we see, okay, after dose 1 for Pfizer, they had, really tiny numbers. 0.1% of 12 to 25-year-olds ended up having medical care in an emergency department or hospital. That sounds super small, right? It's nothing big to be concerned about. It's whatever. Not a big number. And then also after dose 2, we also see a very tiny number, just 0.2% of people ended up in the emergency department or hospital. That doesn't sound like a big number. But if we take those numbers and we apply them to the exact same thought experiment that Dr. Walensky said, if we take 1 million people, 0.1% is 1,000, and 0.2% is 2,000. So altogether, we're talking about 3,000 children and young adults being hospitalized from the vaccine. You can jump in here, Carrie.
I totally agree.
Yeah,
it's right on, because again, if you listen to the testimony, I encourage everyone to go and listen to the Fauci and CDC and HHS testimony before Congress. They do that regularly. I believe it's every 3 months, unless there is a special meeting or a special circumstance. But it's really interesting whenever she's point blank asked the questions that several of us ask here and daily, and she will not perjure herself. So, which is great. I don't want somebody to lie, but what you're reading, and then what she says during testimony when it's the point blank question, how many children is that? What are your plans? Do you know why? And no, she will say, we don't know yet. We are still investigating. We are still looking forward to see where we will be at. But where we are right now, what we are looking at right now says this. And then another senator will ask her, well, when was this data combined? These are hospitalizations up until what date? And then it comes out, well, this was as of May, or, and here we are late June. So they kind of give her a what for that. There was actually one that said, I used to think of the CDC as like the gold standard, and I don't anymore. So I do believe there are some there that they're seeing it, they're hearing it, they're looking at it, but I do not believe they are the majority. So I would encourage everyone to go listen to those hearings and form your own opinion.
Yeah, that's disturbing right there. You'll have to put the link into the comments of this in the end, I believe, because I haven't seen it yet either. I mean, I don't have all the time in the world, but I mean that already what we're seeing is that the numbers that were just involved in terms of hospitalizations, we go from 200 out of a million, and we know those are not always associated with actual illness from COVID-19, to suddenly 3,000 out of a million. And then if we look at the hospitalizations, well, we avoid 8,000 cases, according to her, except in that really tiny little lettering there, we can see that it's 0.6% after the first dose require medical care and 0.7% after the second dose require medical care. Well, that's already 13,000 out of a million requiring medical care. And we've all now had a year and a half of experience seeing that young adults and children don't tend to get ill at all. At most, they might have a mild cold symptoms or things of that nature. But we are now talking about 13,000 children needing medical care versus 8,000 cases.
Now, do you?
So that was one.
Just real quick, because I'm not sure. I don't see it on this. Do you know? I'm assuming this graph was taken from the meeting June 23rd through June 25th. Okay. So this data was only compiled. I believe the cutoff date was June 11th. Do you know off the top of your head of when it was? It June 11th? I thought I heard that during that meeting.
Yeah. It was June 11th.
Right. And I think it's really important. Someone just commented, how many kids will die from a mild case of myocarditis? I don't know what a mild case of myocarditis is. I don't know the definition that they are using for mild myocarditis. I know from personal experience of having what's called myopericarditis, there was nothing mild about it. So I have yet to see a concrete definition of what they are using for mild myocarditis.
Well, I think we actually might find some answers later on here. I think we talked a little before we started there, what they might be considering mild in this instance. And it's not something that normal people would think about. The other thing I wanted to point out about this particular tweet that Dr. Walensky put out there is that first line there, the first thing I underlined, which is 1 million 12 to 17-year-olds, which I think is also critical. Because first, we're talking about a younger age group, one that hasn't had access to the vaccine for as long, and they haven't had as many have second doses. So we already are a little bit, shady with our data there. But the other thing is again, all of these things, or all of these things that I'm showing up, these are all from the CDC's meeting. This is their data. I haven't done anything to it. Maybe boxed some things, maybe underlined some things. This is straight they presented. So what Dr. Walensky was talking about were 12 to 17-year-olds, and I boxed that kind of in orange there. And you can see 12 to 15-year-olds had very, very low numbers for myocarditis in terms of reports. While if we were only looking at 16 to say 24 or 16 to 21, then, well, that makes a big difference in terms of just how many cases we're talking about. You see in the orange box, not so much, but probably doubled easily if you take the green box, even though it's smaller, just because it's where the actual damage is being done. But if you choose the right window, you can control the numbers, and that's what they do. You have to look at the data as it's presented. So next one here was about VAERS. This was supposedly the purpose of the emergency meeting that they decided to delay and then delay again and then just say, we can just put it in our normal meeting, was about these reports of myocarditis. And they wanted to downplay the reports that were sent. And you got to hear all about how VAERS doesn't tell you anything. It's very accurate and doesn't mean anything. They're not validated. Okay, well, let's look at the validation that's going on here. There were only 484 preliminary reports from VAERS, and only 323 of them met the CDC working case definition. Okay, so that's already a pretty big number. And 148 were under review. Okay, so 323 have been confirmed, or at least met their definition of it. 148 are under review still, so they haven't figured out yet. They need more tests at the time of this writing. That leaves 13 of the VAERS reports that they had even glanced at that did not end up being called myocarditis. Just 13 of them were not myocarditis or pericarditis. That is a ridiculously low number. That tells you that VAERS is capturing real cases. This is not about fantasy. These are not people who are putting in joke or false reports. These are real, and the CDC is investigating. The vast majority are real. And then from those 323, 309 were hospitalized. And we don't know about the 148 that are under review. But looking at the numbers that are already there, one would guess that a significant number of those would also be hospitalized. That's a huge number. That's a huge proportion. I don't know how anybody could think anything that involves hospitalization is mild in any way, shape, or form. It's just, that's not mild, not at all. And the next thing that we talked about, I mean, I interpreted it one way, Carrie, and you interpreted it a completely different way, and my head is still spinning from it, is this next line here about 295 were discharged. That's great. That's good news. And it even says that 218, 79% known to have recovered from symptoms at the time of the report. That also sounds really great, right? When you first read that, hey, they've recovered. They've recovered from what? They've recovered from symptoms. And when I personally read that, when I read from recovered from symptoms, I don't hear that the person has recovered from whatever it was. It's not like you broke a leg and now you've recovered and your bone is now as good as new. I hear that as, well, you no longer have your symptoms. And why ever you don't have those symptoms, either due to taking medication to control those symptoms, or being on severe bed rest for 6 months, and all those things. I mean, this when I read that, it seemed like a very odd terminology that they were using. And then you chimed in and blew my brains out. Go on.
So you're not wrong. Part of it is an acute case. So acute meaning sudden onset. So 218 of them had recovered from the sudden onset or the exacerbation of the sudden onset. So their ST elevation, if they had it, their echocardiogram, their EKG, whatever, their elevated troponin, whatever led them in those symptoms had improved, so they were now stable. So the sudden exacerbation or sudden onset of symptoms were no longer an issue. However, and this plays into the one comment that came from, I believe, Shannon, who was paying for these hospitalizations. Cardiac care is pricey. The other thing that they look at is when it's a sudden onset of a long-term illness or long-term disease or long-term condition, they look at, do they meet the criteria established by the Social Security Administration for the disabled? And they have recovered even if they can no longer have their scholarship because they're a college kid and they had a sports scholarship, and now the cardiologist is saying you need to bed rest or light duty, whatever, for 6 months. Yes, they have recovered from that sudden onset. Yes, they can return to ADLs, which is your daily activities. However, they've been modified. So when the Social Security Administration for a long-term care looks at it, no, a professional football player could no longer do his typical job, but he could still work a job. So he would not qualify necessarily for Social Security disability at that time. And we all know, if you've ever dealt with the Social Security Administration, it can be a nightmare, and you have to prove things. Like, you can have 25% of your heart gone and atrophied or no longer able to be used, and you are still not eligible based on that for Social Security disability. You have to meet all of this criteria in order for that to happen. So with it being myocarditis and pericarditis, which up until COVID, it was always called myopericarditis if it involved both the muscle and the tissue lining, then just because it's recovered at the time doesn't necessarily mean there aren't lasting long-term effects. So I think we really need to make sure that we understand that. It can be exactly what Kathryn said. Yeah, that, they're no longer get that crushing feeling in their chest. Their feet are no longer swollen. The sudden onset of symptoms have resolved, or they are manageable. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no long-term effects. And Kathryn had a really, really good explanation of it. My daughter has an autoimmune disorder. If she has a flare-up, then it says that with that flare-up, she has to take either extra medication or she has to be hospitalized depending on what's affected. When that exacerbation of the flare-up is under control and managed, then she's recovered. She still has to, take medication and do special things. Right. Yeah, and it's lifelong. So I think as long as we understand the difference, I think that's really important. Somebody asked, where does it say discharge? If you look where it says of 323 meeting case definition, and then it says underneath that with a red box, 309 were hospitalized. Right underneath that, it says 295 discharged. Yep. And my thing would be discharge for us. When I discharge somebody from a hospital system, I'm discharging them several different places. I'm either discharged to home, I'm discharged, if I'm in the ER, I'm discharging them or transferring them to the floor. I can discharge them to a long-term care facility, or if they've expired, I can discharge them because they're going to the morgue. So I think we really have to understand what discharge means too. Discharge just means they're no longer in that facility. Just throwing that out there.
See, this is why we were late starting today. This right here, just Carrie just throws the bombs where you're like, oh no. That's a different thing. I mean, already when I was looking at that, 295 were discharged and 218 recovered from symptoms, which is, again, as we just went over, that's already kind of shady in the first place. But we're talking about 77 had not recovered, but had been from symptoms, but had been sent home anyway. And I mean, from the stories I've been reading about some of the kids who've experienced this, as far as I understand, if they've been hospitalized, they're going to be essentially on bed rest and on, I think you said beta blockers or whatever it is, the treatment for months and months and months before they'll know what the end result is going to be. And that's it's all kind of glossed over here. It's all kind of like, oh, it's not that much, it's not that many. See, they were hospitalized, but then they're discharged and they're recovered. But I never even thought about the fact that discharge could simply mean discharged to a long-term care facility or some kind of a situation that is not the hospital, but is definitely not home. And,
right. And
again,
it can be home. I just think it's really important. We can do better to separate these, and say, okay, yes, 295 were discharged from the originating facility, but where did those 295 go? Did they all go home? And I think right now it's really hard to say what the long-term effect on all of them are, because we don't know that yet. You can be that 1% that does not have long-term effects of myocarditis that is seen. I know when I had myocarditis personally, and I was young, I was under age 25, that it was not, I was in the hospital, I was in the cardiologist's office every month because they wanted to constantly monitor the atrophy and my lab work. And I still, at 43, go annually. And I don't take any beta blockers or anything like that. And they were very surprised. And they said then, that's very rare. That's very rare that happens, that you don't have something long term. So you're more likely to have something long term with myocarditis than to not. And I have a really nice scar from the myocarditis as well. So I just am not too sure that I'm not confident knowing that and hearing that for these years that all of these individuals went home and I will see them on the basketball court this season. As far as cost, because somebody had said, who's paying for this? And that has been a real issue with these parents. That is their insurance. That's who's paying for it. So they're looking at bills 5-6 figures. And the younger that you have myocarditis or pericarditis, the more likely you are to develop it again. So, it's not one and done all the time.
I would imagine from what I'm reading, yeah, it's probably not, if you think about it, especially the other bomb that you decided to drop on me and then kept dropping it more and more and more on me until I got to a point where I said, okay, we're going to be talking about this a lot. And each little aspect of this, we're going to limit what we're going to do today just because it's just too big. Yeah. But where I wanted to go next in this is to go deeper into exactly what is myocarditis. And so this is from what website was this? It was the Myocarditis Foundation?
Exactly. So where we're pointing some of these patients' families to is the Myocarditis Foundation, because there's a couple of different grants or avenues to help with the costs that they are seeing. And so, of course, there is no liability for the drug manufacturer at this time, or the government, or the school, because it's still technically a choice. So we point them to the Myocarditis Foundation when they say, I don't know what I'm going to do. These I mean, it's stressful anytime you have bills, but bills from something like this, it just seems to add up. And I think it's important to look at, we're hearing myocarditis a lot, but there are two types of myocarditis that happens.
Hold on, wait for it. We're getting there. Fear not. I was just going to start it out here a little mentally with just what is myocarditis,
Right.
which is, it's a disease that causes inflammation in your heart muscle, and it weakens the heart, creates scar tissue. And anybody who's ever had a scar understands they don't go away. And that's kind of a critical thing when we're talking about, you know, mild cases. Well, if there's a scar, then there's a scar. Your heart will never work the same again. The other thing I found interesting in the whole understanding myocarditis part of this website you pointed me to, we'll have to put it in the comments afterwards, or you get to, because I got to go to work, is that they know it often affects otherwise healthy, young, athletic types from puberty to their early 30s. What are we seeing? Exactly that age group, exactly that type of person. And the last part is that it is the third leading cause of sudden death in children and young adults. There is no such thing as mild myocarditis. This is not something to mess around with at all. Now, here's the thing that you pointed out to me, and I had no idea, because I was aware of only viral myocarditis. I mean, I guess I did kind of have an idea. I just didn't know what it was called. But I knew about, you know, viral myocarditis. When you have a viral infection, and that leads to inflammation, and inflammation can cause damage, and et cetera, where it's just how your body is recovering from a viral illness, that you can have inflammation during the infection that can cause myocarditis. I was not aware of the name or its prevalence right now of the second kind of myocarditis, which you informed me of. So go for it.
Yeah, so this is where I was going to, but one thing I did want to point out is the, there's actually two. So the myocarditis, and you look at myopathy, which can lead to cardiac myopathy, and that is the number one of the top 5 causes of the reason why we do heart transplants in the US every year. And I just think that is one really important, especially with the one young lady that did have to have heart and lung transplant. But the other thing is giant cell myocarditis that is here, that I just assumed that everyone knew about. I didn't realize that we were only focusing on one side of, or one type of myocarditis, which is the most common, but we're seeing a lot of giant cell, or not a lot, we're seeing an increase of giant cell myocarditis, which is really, really rare. Believe it or not, it is. But all of a sudden there's kind of an increase. I wouldn't know if I would call it a huge jump, but more than what we typically see. And we see those giant cell myocarditis and those individuals, like my daughter, that has an autoimmune condition, typically a known autoimmune. But if you don't have a known autoimmune and something triggers, and the first thing that the reason why you present to the hospital is giant cell myocarditis, then usually doctors know, okay, this is giant cell myocarditis. We need to look for the reason that it happened, because it's usually an autoimmune, and there are so very few doctors that actually treat giant cell myocarditis. However, what is believed to be the cause of giant cell myocarditis, that's been around since 1905, is, I don't know if you have the next one or not.
I don't think I've actually pulled it up from. No, I did not. I did not take the screenshot of it.
That's okay. But it is
too much for me.
Oh, it's T cell. Your T cell lymphocytes. for whatever reason, they get turned on and your immune response goes crazy in your body, and it ends up attacking the soft organ, and you end up with giant cell myocarditis. And that is a rapid deterioration, just like it says. And it can still respond successfully to treatment, absolutely. But when it happens, it's like the bottom just drops out.
The bottom drops out. Is that what you're saying there? So we're looking at just within a few days, suddenly having a lot of people with some severe myocarditis, not slow inflammation,
right,
but rapid, and within a few days having myocarditis. The other thing about the whole myocarditis thing, the giant cell, is that it is autoimmune in nature. It is, as you say, that you've got your T cells, and as you say, they get ramped up for whatever reason, all, basically agitated and going after anything that they can find, and they happen to find heart muscle or however it works, that they suddenly will start to attack. And
normally they look at that ST elevation, troponin, and echo when they're looking, because this is a sudden decon real quick that happens. So they're more likely to do those things that a kid comes in and I don't feel good, my chest is tight. It might even get dismissed as like anxiety. It slowly happens typically, but when it's, so they might not get that troponin, that ST elevation, or the EKG to show that. And you can still have myocarditis and not have an ST elevation. So I think that it is really important to really recognize the difference of those two. And if you listen to these kids, those that are really struggling, the ones that you're hearing, it kind of mirrors this giant cell myocarditis, whereas mine was, something wasn't quite right. But by day 2, I was like, yes, this is not working for me at all. And it just felt like somebody was taking a belt around my midsection and just kept pulling it and pulling it. And it was with the deep breath in, and then I couldn't take a deep breath, and I couldn't, exhale deeply either. And it was really miserable. There is a comment up here, I think it's Vicky, in it, where she said, talking about the heart function, is that it is important to ask when they say 25% heart function. So when I said that is based on the Social Security Administration. They have like a blue book, red book, I'm not sure what it's called, that they go by to establish for, do you meet the criteria of disabled? And that is what is listed in there. Actually, they do not specify ejection function at all. And then when you get done, we got to make sure that we hit Stacy's comment. I'd like that one to be posted if we can.
Which one?
Stacy's.
She has a couple comments.
Oh, I'm sorry. Why would they push this shot on those with autoimmune illnesses then? Yes.
Mm-hmm. We're getting there.
Yes, we are. There. So save that one.
It's an excellent question. I was paying attention while you were talking. I was like, I'm coming back to that one.
You have smart people.
I do, because they're smart people who know that something's up. So we now know, okay, so there's 2 different types, and now we've talked about, there's the one that we have basically been getting told about, the one that I was understanding was going on, or at least that they were talking was going on, is this, oh, well, it's same as COVID, right? That's what they talked about. They talked about, oh, there's myocarditis from COVID. That's why kids need to be afraid of it. Of course, we now know that that's bunk. The numbers didn't pan out, that it wasn't creating myocarditis in quite the numbers they were afraid of. But in actuality, we have an increase in this giant cell, which is actually an autoimmune reaction. And autoimmunity doesn't just tend to just vanish. That's probably going to stick with you for a lifetime. You'll probably be on drugs, not always, but you're gonna struggle more mightily with something that is autoimmune in nature, because it's your own body continuing the fight unless you can stop your body from doing that. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was, we've talked about the hospitalizations, right? That we've had that number of hospitalizations that had occurred that are confirmed to be myocarditis, pericarditis. But I wanted to talk about the symptoms, because this is again from the Myocarditis Foundation website that you sent me, and it listed these different kinds of symptoms, things like shortness of breath, heart palpitations, chest pain or pressure, so signs of, kind of heart attack situation, which makes a lot of sense, right? The ones that I found most interesting were fatigue, lightheadedness, and a sudden loss of consciousness. Now hold on to those three things right there. That's fatigue, lightheadedness, and a sudden loss of consciousness. Now, this slide is from the CDC's website, or not website, but the June 23rd meeting. This is from their slide deck. And they talked about, okay, this is what acute myocarditis is, and this is how we determine what a case is, right? And so, how do they determine what is a working definition there? And it's the presence of greater than one new or worsening of the following clinical symptoms. And one of the top ones is syncope. And syncope is fainting, so loss of consciousness, just like the last slide, loss of consciousness, that's a big one. Or in younger children, you can see things like irritability, vomiting, poor feeding, and lethargy as being things that you would look out for. Okay, so again, we're looking at nausea, vomiting, lethargy, fatigue, fainting, which is syncope, loss of consciousness, right? So those are some symptoms that are more subtle symptoms of myocarditis. Now here, again, from their own slide deck, this is from vSafe, which is one of the systems they have in place to track symptoms after vaccination. In this way, it's a phone app, and they solicit. So they'll send you a text message saying, "Hey, how you doing? You had your shot between 0 and 7 days ago. How are you doing? Can you fill out this survey for us?" So the system is asking you, give us back some information. And from the people who responded to them, these are the kinds of results they had, some symptoms that these people were experiencing, these children and young adults were experiencing, and what percent of the people who were responded with the different things. And notice it's really teeny tiny, but there are boxes one around fatigue and nausea on the left after the first dose. And we're talking about, for the older set of children, we're talking about 40% had fatigue. Now, fatigue can be caused by other things, of course, but over on the right-hand side, which was 2 doses, after 2 doses, we are now at 60% of the older age group, 16 to 25-year-olds, were experiencing fatigue, and over 20% were experiencing nausea. Okay, well, that's a little bit on the disturbing side. I mean, it doesn't mean they all have myocarditis, but it's one of those things where, Then I go a little further into their slide deck of symptoms, and this is now coming out of VAERS. And look at the adverse events that were listed in VAERS for the 12 to 15-year-olds and 16 to 25-year-olds. You're looking at dizziness, lightheadedness, right? Nausea, syncope, vomiting, loss of consciousness, and fatigue. So you have all of these symptoms, and they are more and more lining up with something that should be setting off alarm bells, that we are looking at potentially mild myocarditis, mild in that it is not so severe that they go to the hospital. And remember, nearly every single one of the cases reported to VAERS were actually myocarditis, and most of those were hospitalized. So what does that make of these kids and young adults who have these vague symptoms? I mean, dizziness. You just, you need to drink more water. If you're Fatigue. Well, you just had a shot. That's just the shot working, right? They will just dismiss it, dismiss it, dismiss it. But if you are having a reaction, an autoimmune reaction, but maybe it's not severe enough to send you to the hospital, how long will it be before we know it? How long will we see? I mean, will anybody investigate it? I don't know. And it was looking at that, and that scared me when I looked at that. Anything you want to say about that?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Anything after the 21-day mark, after the second dose, would not be considered due to the vaccine. It would not be vaccine induced. So those wouldn't be. That's too long of a time. It's really hard, even with a proven FDA-approved vaccine, to connect those two. So going that far after, nope, it's not going to happen.
And of course, autoimmune conditions, depending on how severe the autoimmune condition is, how fast it takes time.
Right, and there's things. Right, and it takes time for, because if my back hurt, well, I've never had a backache, so I can't use that one. But if my shoulder hurts or my hands hurt, I take something for it, right? Because that's what we all do. We mask it. So we'll take ibuprofen or Tylenol or whatever, and we just keep going. Now, when it gets to the point that either you're taking so much that you're like, gosh, I'm really taking a lot of this over time, or it's no longer working, and you seek a physician's assistance and you go and see them, that may take quite some time, especially our young kids, that they are in their 20s, they are invincible. Ask them, they will tell you. And I have that conversation with mine regularly. I'm like, I taught you to eat with a spoon, like, stop it, but they do, they can do anything and they can be anything, which is fantastic to have that, but they might not recognize those symptoms as soon as they should. And I guess that would depend on the kid too, just the individual, but it's more common for them or anyone to just keep going because there's things they want to do. And so, but if it's outside of that 21 days, it's not going to be correlated at all. So I'm sorry for that, but that's not going to happen at this point.
Even though autoimmune damage takes a long time as well to frequently takes a long time to manifest damage.
The thing would be, show me that you weren't that you weren't already predisposed to it. Show me that you didn't already have that, even though it was an underlying but unknown. So if there's an underlying but unknown condition, it's going to be associated with that versus the actual trigger that caused that first domino to fall. Yep. And I just think it's something to be, aware of. And you can develop myocarditis with COVID too. Absolutely. So you have to look at that risk benefits and say, where am I? Numbers, right. Yeah. It's important to look at numbers and look at the studies if there are any, and see what's there. But I know that you have got to get to work, so I'm going to be quiet and let you talk. Sorry.
Well, we only have the one last thing, which of course the bomb you dropped on me like right before we went live, and then Lori was getting rather upset with us because we weren't going live yet, because you decided to send me a paper about neurodegenerative diseases and these SARS-CoV-2 vaccinations. And I just kind of stared at it for a while, and I underlined a whole lot of things in these things. I'm sure I missed a lot in there. But this is just kind of the first little bit here, or rather towards the end. Some of these key points in here about people with neurodegenerative diseases. And first of all, here we're talking about the abnormal immune function often associated with neurodegenerative diseases. So again, what are we talking about? People who have an immune function that is dysfunctional.
So this, the study was comprehensive. So there was a section on Parkinson's, there's a section on ALS, there's a section on Alzheimer's, there's a section on MS, and there's then like a generalized section on autoimmune in general. So it didn't specify, if it was strictly for SJIA or if it was strictly for Crohn's, or it was just very general. So it was an umbrella, just autoimmune. I want to make sure that we give that background. So, because when I say when I say neurodegenerative, that might not be necessarily what others think of. And same with autoimmune. There were several people that said, "Oh, I thought that MS was neuromuscular versus autoimmune," and even in the healthcare world, it's very controversial. Someone say, "No, it's both," or so because the demyelination happening. So it can be. It's just a really good report, and it made my blood boil as a person, as a human that is in the world of these unique neurodegenerative things, because I remember distinctly, very clearly, hearing our governor, get on TV and say, "Now is the time. The first ones we're going to do, after we've done healthcare, is autoimmune and dementia, Alzheimer's." And he specifically said, and this is only the second time I've ever heard the word ALS come out of his mouth, he specifically said ALS. And I thought, that's so strange, because ALS TDI is the leading research lab in the whole world. And they laid out a very blanket statement that said, we don't know yet. Talk to your ALS team, because we just don't know at this time. And then several months later, this study came out, and it's on the NIH website, and it says a whole bunch of different, things for different people. But it's so right there. The immune cells and nerve cells communicate with each other to form a neuroimmune unit. And to patients with neurodegenerative diseases, demyelination of neurons may change neuroimmune function further and affect the effectiveness of the vaccines. Now, if you get on to the website for autoimmune diseases, and they did their own study of people that had got the vaccine, and that's also published on PubMed as well as NIH. And it says, this is what we found. We found that if you have autoimmune disease that is well controlled with your medication, you actually have some protection against COVID. We've also found that those that are taking medication, and it lists, the DMARDs and the different classes of medications that are used to treat autoimmune, the vaccine may not work as well for you. Actually, we have found that those individuals have 3 times less the amount of antibodies if they register antibodies at all. So again, a risk benefit, but you don't hear that. And so I really think it's really important to have those links up, especially if you fall into that classification of individuals. You have to remember, when these first trials were done, because we did, warp speed to get these things out, we included healthy people.
Yes.
We included healthy people. So there weren't a whole lot to go on for trials for SJIA or for ALS. I know I have nobody that I know that had ALS, and we're pretty close group of people that signed up to be in that drug trial. So, I just think it's really important to keep looking. Yes, we've heard it 3 months ago or 6 months ago, but here, this is from April or May. I'm not sure which, to be honest.
I believe this was April.
Yeah, that this was published, and it's right there. And it really breaks it up nicely, and it defines the different types of of inoculations, not just mRNA, but live attenuated or the dead viruses. There's a whole bunch on there that I really recommend that people, especially if they're in that or know someone, their loved one is, because at the end of the day, if there's an adverse reaction, who's taking care of that person? Their loved ones.
You are.
Right. So I think,
no one else.
right. So I think everybody really needs to, is this something that would fit us, or do I already have protection? My daughter takes Enbrel. She has some COVID protection. And when this first came out, we're going, oh my gosh, the two I'm the most worried about is my husband and my daughter. Those were the two, because she takes Enbrel and she had to wear a mask at certain times prior to COVID. And I'm going, yeah, if you sneeze within 5 miles, she gets it. So here we go. What am I going to do? And then I'm like, well, she's not getting it. We had my husband with severe COVID in the home, and she never got it. And then it came out that, hey, if you're taking these, your Remicade, your Enbrel, different ones, that you actually, and it's well controlled, so you're not in a flare up, you might have more protection. And the shot may not work as well for you.
Pretty much. So to kind of simplify, I think, and kind of clarify here as well with what you're talking about here, we're talking about people who have autoimmune-based conditions, which can be neurodegenerative diseases, things like MS, ALS, Crohn's, all of these arthritises and things of that nature, all of these kinds of autoimmune conditions, which of course Governor DeWine and many others are saying, oh, these people are the people who are most at risk from COVID-19. They need to have these vaccinations, right? Well, we already know, and I've actually heard them come out and say that, the vaccine is not as effective in these people because they're taking those medications, which is preventing the formation of antibodies. Now, I've actually said this before as well about specifically the mRNA vaccinations, and why they're so dangerous is because they are triggered on, they will trigger autoimmunity in those who have a genetic predisposition towards it. They have a genetic predisposition towards recognizing self as the enemy. If you have that situation in a person, you can develop autoimmunity. And it just so happens that we're having a rise in myocarditis that is an autoimmune kind of inflammation. Now, we also see this business of, at the bottom of this, what's underlined there as well, talking about exactly that business of the neurodegenerative situation. In this particular section, and there's more to it, but in this particular section, they were talking about the neurodegenerative diseases, and they wanted to specifically say, hey, the vaccines are not going to actually directly act on the nerves. It's not going to basically infect the nerve kind of situation. And they go on and talk about, oh, they're not going to directly impact, but they are going to have immune and nerve cells are going to communicate with each other to create a neuroimmune unit, which regulates the body's defense functions. So the vaccine isn't going to directly affect your nerves, but the combination of your immune system with your nerve cells is going to change because of the vaccination. And they specifically talked about if you are then exposed to those antigenic components, so you're exposed to those antigens, it'll trigger your nervous system, which would control your immune response to what you're being infected with. Is that a fair way of describing it there?
Yeah, it is. I was just looking at Julie's comment. Is that because the meds are preventing inflammation already?
Yes, that's also one of the
Well,
things. I mean, that's one of the things, though. If you have a well-controlled autoimmune condition and you are taking medications designed to suppress your adaptive immune system, your adaptive immune system has a lower likelihood of creating new autoimmune
so
conditions.
well, there's anti-inflammatories. That's what controls inflammation. But then there's a couple other classifications, and I will post a link after this so you can read it for yourself. It's directly from the Arthritis Foundation, and it's published on the NIH website as well. But the disease modifying group of
DMARDs,
meds, yeah, we call them DMARDs. So like your Enbrel is, that's what they do. They modify disease. So you're putting that injection in of and wanting to trigger a response, but it's like a brick wall up and it kind of bounces it back. So you're not getting the effect of that that injection or that vaccination that you want, because you're taking a medication to stop it, kind of like that gatekeeper. It stops. So I think that's why that particular drug class. But obviously, you know, if you're taking an anti-inflammatory, yeah, it's keeping the inflammation down. But what is triggering that inflammation? So once you find out what, right, I think once you find out what that is, yes. So, yep. But the conclusion of this study, like and I think that's where my head, if I could have found the governor and just, or Ohio Department of Health. Yes, because it's very telling. In the next 5 years, a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine that is safer and more effective for elderly patients and patients with abnormal immune function should be developed. In any case, for these immunocompromised patients, vaccination should be approached with caution. Clinicians need to closely observe the responsiveness of patients with neurodegenerative diseases to vaccine candidates. At this time, thorough discussions are needed to reach a consensus on vaccinating patients with neurodegenerative diseases. So we already know.
How many healthcare workers have autoimmune conditions? How many healthcare workers have genetic predisposition towards it? And yet we are now at the place where there are thousands of healthcare workers who are about to lose their job if they don't take this. And we know it. We know it already that they should not, or at least there should be some heavy considerations.
There needs to be a lot of dialogue. Now, we know with autoimmune diseases, there's just some types of vaccines that classification of people, they can't take. My daughter being one of them. We know they can't because they're already behind the gate or behind that 8 ball to be able to take those. And then there's another classification of vaccines that you need to come off of your meds for a certain amount of time for. We just don't know when it comes to our mRNA ones at this time, because we don't have a good solid foundation yet of anything historically. And I will say, and I've said it before, and I'll say it till I'm blue in the face, mRNA is fascinating and has shown a lot of promise in target tumor research. There are some cancers that respond well and have done fantastic with mRNA because that's what they do. They go in there to that target and they hit it. And I believe strongly that there have been lives saved or extended based on that. But an mRNA and a vaccine arena there's just not enough.
It's a dangerous game to be playing small numbers of people, and we're playing that game with millions and millions of people with highly variable
So to say
environmental exposures.
And that's the thing. So if we have somebody that develops, there has been nothing, they've had no signs, symptoms, anything, they get the second dose of whatever, pick one, and 45 days later, They are now having issues, can't walk, and it's determined that they have MS or ALS. And that, first of all, that's not going to be associated with that vaccine. No matter what you or I believe in our heart it should be, it's not going to happen because it's outside of that 21-day dose or 21-day post.
They don't do it with older vaccines either.
No,
and with
no,
propaganda around new vaccines, there's no way they
Right.
will associate these things.
No.
They just
Second of all, you don't have there's nothing to even correlate it with at that point for that. But if they were to do genetic testing and you are genetically predisposed, like say you have the C9orf72 or SOD1, any of those gene mutations that have been associated or known to cause any of these things, then there it is. It was never the vaccine to begin with because you already had that gene mutation. So it is what it is. And I think that it's really important, again, to look at that for everyone. And I will never tell somebody, don't do something. I'm a firm believer in that every treatment should be available to everyone, provided that they have informed consent and they know what they are looking at. And they have done a personal benefit risk assessment. I would love to be able to have some treatments available to us. So I can't sit here and say, don't get it, don't get it, don't get it. Knowing in my heart that I feel that everybody should have accessible to all of it. But I just feel like they really need to look and research and read. You have someplace like the Arthritis Foundation that publishes or gets published at the NIH or at PubMed. You need to look at those as well, because what we're hearing from our governor that has zero medical background saying it's 100% safe and effective for everyone. That is a blanket statement. That is a dangerous statement at best. Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure that when we say 100% effective and safe for everyone, we know that our federal agencies are saying, that might not be the case. So did the CDC drop the ball? I think that the CDC drops the ball on a lot of things, as does the FDA and HHS and CMS. But you have to look at what is their scope of practice. What is their responsibility? Their responsibility is to, in particular, CDC. They do not regulate anything. They are nothing more than an agency that releases guidance and guidelines. Now, you can modify those guidelines at any time. We know that Ohio has for years. Our typical vaccination schedule is not in line with CDC because it's specific to Ohio. It was taken a little bit to the extreme with this whole pandemic because they piecemealed it, and that just should have never been done. But we've done it for years. That's happened. So just because the CDC puts out guidance, it's important to, and I see this a lot on the media, or I see people post and they'll put like 1, 2, or 3 sentence area. You need to read that whole guidance, first of all, and then remind yourself it is guidelines. It is not a regulatory agency. So as far as they're concerned, they posted all of this in April or whatever the date was for neurodegenerative diseases, for immunocompromised, for elderly. Of course, you can't unvax yourself. So how many of those people in those categories had already been vaxxed? But they did their job. They put it out. If the media or the governor or the Department of Health says something different, that's on them. As far as they're concerned, they met their responsibility of disclosing it. It is
Or
frustrating.
disclosing it in the way that we just looked at, which is that yes, they disclosed it, but they gave interpretations or impressions that
Right.
are not in line with how normal people would look at the
Oh, for
situation.
sure. And it
200
seems
hospitals.
like, right. And it seems
I mean,
like as
that's so
soon as they put something out that, you know, somebody will say we're mandating it per CDC. And I mean, you can, I guess there's nothing that says you can't, but just because it's put out by the CDC as a guidance doesn't mean it's tailored specific for your business or your school. And if you really delve into the school guidance that's really recently been put out, there is no school that doesn't have an out. That guidance is so broad. So those that are using it, that guidance as, oh, the CDC said we have to mask our kids when they go to the bathroom, but not when they go to lunch, or whatever the situation is. I would encourage a parent to really read that guidance and respond, because they're not going to be fined for not following CDC guidelines, because it's not a mandate. It's a guidance.
They do not have, and also that they play such gigantic games with those numbers, saying that there were 200 hospitalizations prevented by 1 million vaccinations, while at the same time showing evidence, or their own data shows that 3,000 children on those same numbers would be getting hospitalized post-vaccination. There's one last thing I'd like to wrap up saying, from what you were talking about there a moment ago about autoimmunity. The cycle that we are trapped in right now, where if you are a person, and I've said this many times as well, and you as well, where if you are predisposed to autoimmunity, these vaccines can stimulate that autoimmune response. And if you then you take the vaccine and then you develop that autoimmunity, as you just said, you develop that autoimmunity, then you might get genetically tested. And, oh, look, that person has a genetic predisposition towards that autoimmunity, so it couldn't have been vaccine. And then you just go in a nice little circle, and it will never be the vaccine. You have the genetic predisposition. You take the vaccine, which stimulates the actual disease, and then the disease is blamed on the genetic predisposition.
Right. Yeah.
It's a nice racket.
So I know that we're past that hour mark, and I know she's got to go to work, so we are going to wrap up, because I would never be able to hold my attention span for longer than an hour at all. So kudos to those who stuck it out and stayed with us. That's fantastic. And I don't know, same time, same place next week. I'm not sure. That'll be up to Kathryn. Probably. I'm just along for the ride.
Probably. We're gonna work out some things. We're gonna have some short interviews designed to hopefully be cut into little pieces and sent off onto Twitterland to hopefully go viral, stories about how individuals are being affected in different ways. More on that hopefully later. Those will probably be in the late evenings going forward. So I believe most likely the next one of these will be about the same time next Tuesday. We're still working out details.
Is there a way, I don't know, Julie Wiseman just had the best comment. Can we save that for next time? Is there a way to do that? She talks about hospital 6. It is, okay.
Yep.
All right. Awesome.
All right.
See, I'm learning these
Thank you, everyone.
technological things. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Bye.